Hi, everybody. David Nour back with another episode of our Inner Circle podcast. I am delighted to have a longtime friend and colleague and someone I admire and look up to, Joel Koblentz, joining us. Hello, Joel.
Hey, David, great to see you.
It's great to have you. For our audience, we're live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. This is the Inner Circle podcast. I'm giving you a glimpse into the next book. As many of you know, I've been blessed to write a few of these and books. Several of you have asked. Take me about 4 years for the ideas to percolate. And at some point, you've read enough, you've talked enough, you've researched and interviewed folks enough that you feel like you finally have something to say. But I don't want any of my books just be my opinions or my perspectives. I tend to think of them as a hypothesis. Here's kind of what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm observing. Here's what I'm thinking about. Now, let me go do not just research, but also interviews and talk to executives like Joel that, again, I like, I respect, I trust, I appreciate their perspectives and really bring them into the conversation of here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? And are you seeing this in different walks of life? And can you share examples and stories? And I think you're in for a treat because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. The title of this session is really navigating leadership succession. Obviously, we're going to incorporate Inner Circle and the insights from Joel. What I appreciate about operators like Joel, you're not going to hear him regurgitate a book report, right? Operators who are in the job on a day in and day out basis really bring phenomenal experiences and real world perspectives, kind of front row seat to both challenges and opportunities. And I'm reminded of my dad drove into us that, life's challenging enough for you to make, you can't make all the mistakes yourself. Learn from other people's mistakes. And if they've been along this journey and they're further along than you are, learning the pitfalls they've been in and out of, challenges and corners they've seen will become invaluable to you. For our audience, I would encourage you jump in with your comments, and we'll take them live in the session. We also will repurpose this as a podcast, so wherever you consume podcasts, if you just search David Nour Inner Circle, you'll find it. So, Joel, let's start with a brief introduction, a little about your background, where you've been, what you've done, and a little about the Koblentz Group.
Well, we started as an independent firm in 2007. Prior to that, I'd had 20 years of executive search experience with one of the major firms, but I'm not a human resource person, honestly. I was chief of strategy of a New York Stock Exchange company very early in my career, probably ahead of my skis, to be honest with you, David. And it was an interesting experience because it talked about how you create value. The CFO of that company, who was a peer of mine and much more experienced than I was much more of a controller type. So I got my experience basically dealing with financial issues and moving assets around a balance sheet and trying to straighten out some businesses based on financial strategies, but I had no operating experience. How I got into this was I took over an operating business of the company. I wanted operating experience. And when I took it over, I found out there was an officer fraud problem. We discovered it. It was the president reporting to me, the CFO reporting to me, and the president of a division reporting to that president. And, I'd never faced anything like this before. Who does, really? Who wants to? I mean, so I ended up not knowing anybody in the city I'd moved to, which at that time was Atlanta. And it was a pretty good sized business for Atlanta at that point in time. It was a $500 million business. And the largest businesses in town were Delta Airlines, a couple of banks, and the utilities companies, basically. So there weren't very many companies. So there were some eyeballs on us, and we had to watch it. So with the local law firm, King and Spalding, and we worked through doing a forensic audit and trying to figure out what the issues were. But then I had to replace those people. We kept them on so we could kind of watch them and see what they were doing, see if the premise of the crime was in fact the crime, and it was. We found assets being moved to various places, and we had to replen airplanes and all these other things. And as it turns out, I used executive search for these positions, and they honestly did a very miserable job.
Wow.
So So I ended up, and they are names that, everybody would know. Um, and I ended up doing it myself with the help of one of the partners at King and Spalding. And actually, I enjoyed it much more than moving assets around a balance sheet.
So
So
I don't
that
want to
moved
say
me
you.
into
I don't
this.
want to say you were Doge before Doge was cool, but it sounded like you did uncover some challenging opportunities.
Abuse for sure. I don't know about the other stuff, and I'm talking about my own personal abuse as part of it. But it kept me up at night because I couldn't really trust the people that I worked with,
Mm,
and as I'm sure we'll talk about trust and today, and that's really a critical element in business success and in success in life, really. So it got me into this business, and the Koblentz Group, when it started in 2007. Our goal was not to be the name on everybody's lips, but to be the sensitive matters firm at the very top of the house. So we have worked for the boards and CEOs of companies, advising them behind the scenes. We're more of eminence grise, where we have the whisper in the ear kind of responsibility, but don't want the press. So you won't see us talking to the Wall Street Journal or whatever about our work. And we get those calls, but the answer is no.
mm.
Clients first. The firm has had really much more success than I think we deserve. But reputation, like in any business, is what people say about you when you're not there. And we have 98% completions. 80 some percent of our clients are repeat clients. They stay with us, and that's the surest benchmark of satisfaction.
Sure.
So
So you and I,
yeah, I
yeah,
was just going to say all of our people are not human resource people. None are actually.
that's fantastic. So you and I have had several conversations in the 20 years we've known each other about relationships. Given your experience in a lot of leadership and board advisory work, I'm genuinely curious. What comes to mind when you hear this idea of inner circle? Just forget the book for a second. What comes to mind when you hear this kind of trusted, high valued relationships?
Well, you've said the word. It's trust. Anybody who would join a board today, they'll be enticed. They'll be interested in joining it. There aren't that many seats available. We can talk about that if you like. But more importantly, they will find out very quickly that there's an inner circle on the board.
Mm,
And those are people who are trusted by the board chairman and trust each other. In fact, many people say by the time they get to the board room for their quarterly meeting or so, decisions have already been taken, okay, and baked in because of that inner circle. In the work that we've seen with companies, and they could be public companies, could be private companies, could be family offices or family businesses. One, you find that sometimes they're very closed,
mm,
and the leadership in these companies, uh, it first of all, I just say CEO is probably the most. Uh, I'd say it's the loneliest job in the entire organization. Think
mm.
about it. It's by the time the information gets to a CEO, it's been sanitized. The decks have been changed. The words to use with Miss X or Mr. Y have been carefully chosen. In fact, I talked to a company yesterday that they're visiting with the board chair next week, and they started the deck in November.
Mm.
So, you can and the words that they're trying to change now are so minor that they're wasting their time on that. So it's a lonely job.
Sure,
So these CEOs and these board members and most successful people have an inner circle of people. They may call it by different names.
sure.
Their relationships built on trust, on insight, on caring, on commitment to each other's mutual life success,
Mm.
which can be business success as part of it. But I see that as being in a world that seems to be more connected electronically and less connected personally. This is where it really becomes extraordinarily valuable in
Love,
making the right choices because the choices aren't always that clear.
love it. And you and I have talked about this. That trust doesn't happen overnight. It is
Mhm.
years of interacting. It is. Would you agree? If you've also gone through some ups and downs, whether it's economical or the company issues or whatever together, it really deepens, it really solidifies that relationship, because you're not just seeing the other person through a rose-colored glasses. You're seeing them for the human beings and fallible that they are.
You're absolutely right. And I would say to you that that is absolutely true. That deepens the relationships. But also, I think there's this misnomer that that the highest utility is the economic utility. It is not. It's the time utility. It's the effort and time that you put into these relationships and how you build them and how you care about people. And one of the questions I get, from people I see on occasion is, how did you remember that about me? How did you? And if you care enough, you're going to remember. You don't have to have great notes or a big database or any of that, but you care about them, and you make a note to call. One thing I do personally is I try and do something for somebody every day that they don't know I'm doing for them. Okay, to help them. Okay, and sometimes it comes back to them, sometimes it doesn't. I don't keep a scorecard. But I know that there are people who care deeply about what they're trying to accomplish, and they want to do more with their lives. And when you read what some people have done in their lives, you see it in these long obituaries in the New York Times, for example, and you see some of the people you've never heard of, but what they've accomplished in life. Then you really understand that there's so much more that each of us can do in these relationships. And an example I can give you is the guy that became the pioneer of the equipment that's being used in arthroscopic surgery. Before then, doctors were using mirrors and miners' hats and what have you. Well, the story one of his colleagues told was that George passed away at 102, but at 100, we would meet once a week in his office at the lab at 7 a.m. He said by then George had his coat on and he was already finishing his third cup of coffee. So, his care, his deep care for his colleagues, his deep care for his work, his deep care of what he could give back, his deep care about the human condition. That's not saying you're politically one way or another, but it does tell you that you are willing to put yourself on the line for their benefit, and hopefully the return will be the same.
Have you found this to be a generational attribute? Like, do the younger, that next, I don't call them next gen, but that next up leaders that are this, they're technically competent, they're very capable, they're very good at what they do, but they miss some of these nuances. Do you see that as a gap potentially? And or I'm also curious about your take on the post-pandemic. Have you seen any changes in how we connect and engage in a meaningful way post-pandemic?
Well, there's no question that the way that people in, let's say, our generation view relationships is different, perhaps, and the value that we see in them. Maybe it's maturity. Don't know for sure, but I do sense that the younger generation is a lot of what can you do for me today? Okay. And there's some of that in our generation too, David. I mean, right? But I do think that we tend to value relationships, recognizing that relationships are built on lifelong learning. And maybe that generation hasn't lived long enough yet to do that. You remember Charlie Munger, who was Buffett's partner and right-hand man. Charlie gave a lecture at Stanford about 20 years ago, and he talked about how he got up every day. Now, he was a man of close to 80 at that time. He got up every day and spent an hour reading about something he knew nothing about. Okay? And if you think about the world as being that interconnected, that the lessons you can learn from gene sequencing or archaeology absolutely apply to economics, because economics is a behavioral science. So if you understand how these spheres all kind of intertwine, and they're all intertwined by one thing: humans and their relationships.
For our audience, if you just joined us, you're listening to Joel Koblentz, senior advisor of the Koblentz Group, 20-plus year friend and colleague. And I got to tell you, I pick up wisdom every time I talk to Joel. And these nuggets are invaluable. So let's talk about, if you were creating that inner circle today as a leader, what steps would you take? What attributes would you consider? Joel, how would you advise someone, maybe a first time CEO, or certainly someone who's a first time in a material leadership position? How would you encourage them to build their inner circle?
Well, the first thing I would do is carefully define what's important. What's your value system? What do you really value in relationships? And part of that is, are you willing to accept that you don't have the answers? Okay. But if you are willing to do that, then I think it's the first step in trying to understand the quality of people that you want around you. There's always several types of people, and I don't like to talk necessarily in terms of buckets, but you're going to have those that you trust on more of a personal basis. And sometimes those are maybe people who provide services to you. Maybe it's your lawyer, or maybe it's, a family friend, or what have you. But then there are those that understand that there's a complexity of leadership today, an acceleration of change, pressures that most leaders haven't faced. Why do I say that? Well, let's look back at just some basic numbers. If you were to look at private equity investments, in over 70% of the private equity investments, new investments or newly acquired investments by private equity, within 1 year, or I'd say probably within 6 months, they're going to change out the CEO. Okay. We also know that we had the highest turnover of CEOs in the fourth quarter of last year in public companies that we've seen since the 1980s, maybe before. And all of that changes the whole tenure of the organization. And one can talk about why these changes are taking place, but it's certainly the asymmetrical changes in the environment. You mentioned COVID. I think too much is made of that at this point. We're well beyond it. But I think a lot of this has to do with trying to position yourself to think about a world that you don't know, that you cannot predict. Okay. And the pressures that one is under for short-term performance while one is trying to navigate these tremendous changes that are in front of us. And you can look at industries. If you were to look at the entire airline industry since it began and added up all the profitability and losses of all the airlines that have been in this business since the 1930s, so almost 90 years, right, at this point, and you looked at, has that industry ever been profitable on a total aggregate basis? The answer is no. Okay, we saw it yesterday with the downshift in the guidance that the Delta was providing. Okay, so it's pretty consistent. So one looks at this and says, well, okay, how do I make sure I don't get myself wound up too tight around the axle in my own thinking, and how do I utilize and give back to those that really can help me, draw me out, make me think about a problem differently, and make sure that I'm concentrating on the right problems, not a bunch of things that don't help me align priorities with strategies, with operating results. And then the question is, then it becomes not the what and the how, but the who. Who's going to do it? And that's becoming a huge challenge, because you talked about the generational differences and the commitment to situations. We know, the research has showed, that if somebody is in their early 20s today and maybe plays out their cards until their 60s, they may be in 20 different situations, where in my generation and yours, if you were in 4 or 5 situations, but more than that, they'd say you couldn't hold a job. So, these societal plates keep moving. And there's no way, if you're running a company, that you can keep current on all of this. There's just no way. So you use this inner circle for people for eyes and ears and accessibility and ideas, and have you thought about? One company we're involved in is a sports analytics company, and they principally are providing sports analytics to high school football players to Division II and Division III because those schools don't have the budgets to recruit like the superpowers in Division I. And had several conversations with them as being part of that inner circle with that CEO about the value of women in sports and how that's changing. And the analytics are even more difficult to come for these coaches who don't have those kind of budgets. They have even less of a budget. So is there a market there? And it's something they hadn't really thought about because they've been so intertwined with trying to get the product and service right for their principal market that they're not thinking ahead. But a lot of the basics that they're talking about can be applied to a lot of different things, a lot of different sports.
So love that. The world that is changing at an accelerated pace. Surround yourself with a personal board of advisors, personal directors that become that sounding board, I've long called them signal scouts, or they bring a unique perspective, unique lens. And Joel, what I love is they ask you questions that you haven't even thought of. They challenge your assumptions and assertions. They help you see this potential path forward, opportunities, challenges with a different lens. My question of you is, you've been invited, you've been asked to join. What are some of the rules of engagement? What are some of the behavior traits that you would admire if you're also in that group? And you and I see some of these in boards, but I'm genuinely curious in that intimate, kind of highly curated, high valued relationships. What are some of the expectations?
Well, I'm going to step back because if you're an advisor in what, you're one of the trusted advisors in this inner circle, everyone that wants to build one of these things or really wants to have one, really, you have to gauge whether they really mean it. Okay. What I've noticed is that several talk about it, but then they really don't engage with this inner circle the way that they would, or they don't engage in a collective way with them. Certainly there's always individual conversations and so forth, but they don't engage with them as a group because the real value is the group itself saying, David had this great idea. Have you thought about it? Well, I had it in my company, and here's some of the things. It's the bounce off from one another, but you have to be in a position to, if you say you want that, you have to say, okay, I'm willing to live with the fact that I'm going to hear things that probably I haven't heard before, or maybe critical of what I am doing. Okay, but the second part is whatever that group does or says, you can't just blow it off. You have to agree to say, as part of the rules, the operating rules, I'm going to listen to you, and I'm going to come back and tell you what we did about it. Okay. So, and the third is the cadence. How often does a group really want to meet? You can meet one-on-one, have breakfast with one of your advisors, say, I have a specific question, or I'm struggling with this, or I'm dealing with a family problem that's pulling me away, and so I have to kind of narrow my focus on only one or two priorities. Here's what we talked about in the last meeting. Here's the 4 or 5 I should be focused on. Which 2 or 3 do you think are most critical right now? And I'll tell you, or I think these are what do you think? And it's a lot of what do you think, but you got to be able to absorb it. You got to be the shock absorber of taking the criticism and so forth. And help, and be willing to take the help.
Yeah, absolutely. I love private company boards because a lot of times those CEOs want your help, want your lens and perspectives.
The key is no ego.
There you go.
There's no ego among the directors or advisors. There's no ego on behalf of the CEO. They're all there for one another. And you can ask yourself, why do people do this? I mean, why would they? Well, because they're learning something too. They're not doing if you pay them, they're not doing it for the money, I can assure you.
Love it. You brought up a stat earlier that I got to tell you, I wrote down and just kind of, I put an asterisk by it. We got to come back to. You said, PE investments, 70% of new within 6 months to a year. They're changing the CEOs. 1, 2, Q4 of last year, highest turnover of CEOs. I think you said in some time. I'm genuinely curious. Give us the top 2-3 reasons you believe that's the case. A, CEO turnover. B, PE firms who do that. And then I want to also know the common pitfalls organizations face when they go through some sort of a CEO or a leadership succession. What are you seeing, the mistakes they make?
Well, let's start with the statistics first, and the reasons that it does take place. Of course, with new owners, obviously they're expecting a premium on whatever price they pay for it, and they're looking, if it's private equity, they're looking for a payout in 3 to 5 years. And one of the reasons that PE is struggling, some of them right now, is because there are not that many properties or investments that they can make that will have that kind of a yield. We have one client, for example, some time ago, who paid 15 times EBITDA for a deal. And, when we started looking at PE firms some years ago, if it was above 5 times EBITDA, people would say, that's crazy. We can't make any money at that. Well, they're going to hold this thing a long time to get that kind of money. But if you ask most PE people what their worst day is, it's not operating these businesses. And I'll come back to your question in a second. It's not operating these businesses. It's returning capital to the investors that they couldn't deploy. So they tend to pay up for these things. And when they pay up for these things, or they have an expectation or thesis of why they invested, the people who brung them to the dance, meaning the company, may not have the rhythm and the beat to take it forward. And those are assessments that they make. And oftentimes they use an outside advisor, somebody from that particular sector who knows something about that business, who maybe uncovered that investment for them or is willing to step in. So that's part of it. With the public companies, the turnover there, the research suggested that, at least the last survey, that about 80% of that turnover this last year, not only in the fourth quarter, but we saw it building up during the year, 80% of them said that they left on their own. Well, we all know how that goes. The chairman calls you in and said, well, things ain't working, Bob, the way we'd like them to work. Why don't you resign? Okay, I'll resign, and they work through the financial aspects of it. Sure. I'm oversimplifying this, of course, but so let's say the number is 40%, not 80%. But when you look at the reasons why, it's because they were hired as if they were, guns, if you will, ablazing to develop and build value in that company. But the world changed, and the social aspects of running these companies have changed, and the demands on them in running these companies and running leadership is not what they signed up for, nor are they really qualified to handle it. And we've seen that change in a variety of different companies. So I think the survey is probably correct, that that's the principal reason. The second principal reason that they resign is for economics. If you're loaded with equity and the markets are at an all-time high, and it's the principal part of your personal financial well-being and plan, looking at what we were looking at, the risk of changing governments and the risk of keeping the government we had, depending on your point of view, and looking at a company that was $35 trillion in debt and markets that were uneven around the world, are you willing to stay on, or are you going to cash out? Okay. And many of these CEOs have moved on, and there's also the lure of being in private equity, where the payoff is longer term. And maybe not necessarily longer term, but certainly greater because the equity percentage is greater.
Sure.
And so there were those three principal reasons. There wasn't the reasons that we historically had seen was, disagreements with the board. Now we do know that activist shareholders play into all of that too. Activist shareholders, there's over 1,400 hedge funds in the country. And believe me, they're not run by the nicest of people all the time or the most helpful. Okay, so those are things that CEOs, especially first-time CEOs, struggle with. Okay, we also know that the CEOs themselves, if it's a first-time CEO, has probably come from the outside in. The trend has now been from the outside in, where before it was principally the inside progression. And that changes the tenure of these organizations and how they think about the world, because a new CEO will come in, and in many cases, he or she is going to be asked to be a cultural chiropractor. How do we adjust? How do we adjust the culture to align to these asymmetrical changes that we're seeing, so that we can create some competitive advantage, improve our margin and operating efficiencies, and somehow build a moat around what we're doing, if that's at all possible. And you start to see that in some of the companies that are now being split up, Honeywell, DuPont, that are going into 3 different companies.
Mm.
You see Boeing splitting off. You saw Las Vegas Sands selling its Las Vegas properties and concentrating in a certain area in Asia. You're beginning to see this move away from multiplicity of ownerships and interests into something more central. Even inside of Disney, where are they concentrating today? Okay. And you see it in one company after another. But what the basis of these changes in the end of the day is, how do we get closer to our customers, really understand what it is they're really facing, and along those lines, how do we play into that help equation? Because if we can, then we'll build a relationship with them that perhaps is stronger than the one we have today.
So talk about the common pitfalls organizations face during succession planning. Joe, what are they not thinking about? What are they not doing in really developing that bench to be able to step up and step in, when needed?
The challenge is the boards, in some ways, don't want to press the CEOs for succession. And they don't want to do it because they don't want to lose the devil that they have for a devil that they don't know. Okay, they're not willing to trade off. So that's just something that's we've seen more often than not. Okay, but the CEOs themselves don't see themselves as being long term, and so they do get pressure from the board to continue, now more than ever, for succession planning. But succession planning hasn't been as successful as people think. Look at what happened to GE. Look at what happened at Home Depot. Look at what happened at P&G. Look at what happened at Disney. Look at what happened at Boeing. I mean, the list would go on.
Starbucks. I mean,
Starbucks is a great example of that. Brian Nichols, I think he's finally, made some inroads there. But it is very, very, very difficult to understand how to do this right. But it does take a commitment by the board and the CEO to work together to truly understand what the priorities are that this individual will likely face. Now, we all know those priorities are going to shift. Market conditions shift. So what they can't have trouble baking in is adaptability, agility, resilience, leadership through crisis, ability to communicate and touch everyone. So touch the team, touch the customers. Okay, the customers are going to see the crisis. Your customers, your clients are going to see the crisis before you do. Okay, so being in touch with them is really important. We've encouraged CEOs and board members to go out and talk to customers. Not do silly ads on television. I think the Jersey Mike ads are particularly interesting.
Yeah.
But look at CEOs aren't necessarily effective pitchmen on television either. So that's not touching customers.
Yeah.
And really understand what the role is of the leader in a company. And many of them have lost some of that. Bernie Marcus used to call the headquarters of Home Depot, who I worked closely with for years. He used to call it the store support center. Okay, because the stores were close to the customers, and he wanted them to have the support that they needed to understand what the customers really wanted, needed, and how they wanted to be cared for.
Mm.
If you want to know why Starbucks lost its way, it was an experience. It wasn't the $7 cup of coffee or whatever it was. Okay, it was come in there, have a chat. It's like, have a chat, sit down, but it lost its way. It lost its way with products. It lost its way with cleanliness there. People would sit there all day on their computers. There wasn't even a place to sit. And so, it takes a lot of care to just find out what that customer really wants, what that supplier really needs. and whether in fact you're in a position to help them.
For our audience, if you just joined us, you're listening to Joel Koblentz, senior advisor at the Koblentz Group, 20 plus year friend, colleague. And I'm convinced Joel forgets more of wisdom in 5 minutes than I might be able to gain for years. So it's always delightful to catch up with him. Talk about, if you could kindly, and I love that. I think I'm going to get some t-shirts made. Cultural chiropractor. You're brought in to adjust kind of what's happening. Talk about examples where cultural misalignment really impacts that leadership transition, and how can organizations prevent it?
Let's start with think of an Oreo, David. Think of an Oreo. Boards or the ownership is the top of the cookie, and at the bottom and the middle is the leadership. Okay, and then the bottom of the cookie is the team. Okay, what you're really leading. And oftentimes, the pressure of the priorities come from the ownership. Here's the things that we absolutely have to do and the results that we expect from those priorities. Then it's up to the leadership, the people in the middle, the CEO and their top teams, to define the strategies that they're going to pursue to deliver those priorities. And then how are they going to deliver them? Well, the deliverable has to come through the operating units and the touch of the customer. So there's this alignment on one hand, and on the other hand, it's the operating people who oftentimes will say, "Not in my swim lane. I've never done it before. Why should I do it now?" Okay, and so you find the leadership in the middle part of that cookie on the white horse, with the saber pointing forward and saying, "Let's go," and looking back, and the team's looking back at vapor trails. I mean, they're going the other way sometimes. So I think the ability to manage that level of change and being able to express it in such a way that it's inclusive, that you are part of the solution here. You're not part of the problem. If you become part of the problem, then what have you. But with leaders, the most important thing is not the words. People are watching. Your people are watching. Your customers are watching. All of your stakeholders are watching. It's the actions that you take consistent with the culture that you yourself as a leader want as permissive and important in order to create that value paradigm that we were talking about. And if you don't have that, then the chances of success are going to be minimal. Now, there's no question you're going to fail. Okay, I mean, the world is full of failures. The only question becomes, am I willing to take the path, or is it more risky to take the path than sit tight? And sometimes it is more risky to take the path, but once you start taking it, and you have a team that can facilitate change and be able to deliver it in such a way that's inclusive, where the team is all working together, the chances of stepping in the same pothole twice are very, very small. And the risk of not doing something is not a risk that you're willing to accept. Now, today with AI, and you and I have had this conversation. We'll share it with the audience. There's going to be a question of just, with the outside pressure on boards and CEOs to develop and implement AI, are they really being the pioneers who are going to take the arrows, or is it really going to be carefully crafted to really deliver operating leverage, improve margins, improve quality of service, improve competitive position? And some are so far ahead of their skis here that the risk of perhaps of them doing less wouldn't be a risk at all. Okay, so sometimes things need to shake out. Okay, and you need a team that really is observant of the environment that they're in and the feedback that they're getting, so that they're not just hell bent on a railroad track just going down the track. Okay, but that's where leadership comes in, and that's where your inner circle comes in, to make sure you're asking the right questions that maybe you were either fearful to ask as a leader. Maybe you didn't pose it in the right way. Maybe you didn't pose it in the right forum. Maybe you didn't ask the right people.
Yeah.
But one more comment, if I might, on inner circles. about that. Inner circles aren't always your top people inside of an organization. Sometimes it's your experts that people don't even know about, but they know more about that particular subject. And where I learned about that was an interview I did with Jack Welch some time ago at GE. And I don't think Jack could run these kind of companies today. Okay, he couldn't. But Jack Welch used to spend a couple hours a week with somebody who could teach him technology. Okay, so somebody was down, some person who was perhaps a 1 or 2 year person at GE who was working in applied technology who could teach him the power of what this could be. So even he was open to folks like that.
Some of the, I got to tell you, some of the best CEOs I know, best executives I know, get out of the mahogany row, get into the mailroom, get prioritize their own personal and professional kind of learning and growth. So they have their finger on the pulse of the industry. And when customers ask or they bring it up, it's a really rich conversation. I want to circle back to something you mentioned. I read one of your articles, Breaking Through to the New, that emphasized the value of diverse perspectives. And you brought up kind of you need diverse thinking, in that sense, cognitive diversity around that inner circle. As we both know, DEI kind of went on a tangent and it hasn't fared well recently. But I think you and I are talking about different type of diversity. Talk about that diverse perspectives and how can leadership teams integrate really different views around that inner circle?
Well, it starts with respect, really. There's no stupid question or stupid comment. Some of the most simple, basic comments or questions oftentimes lead to the most introspective points of view and really opens up the can of worms that nobody wanted to open but needs to be looked at. Okay. And I think that's important. The diversity, though, comes not only with respect, but it's a team that's learning together. Not everybody has the same level of knowledge, and they bring their own perspective that maybe the others around the table don't know about. Okay, so I was mentioning that there's a convenience store group that we were involved in and may well be involved again. And one has to ask, with what's going on in the convenience store business, what's really the economics of that business? Well, it was always about gasoline and, you could come into the store and get this or that. But if you look at the economics of it, and I'm using this just as a play on words, the margin on a large Snickers bar is probably equivalent to the margin that most of these filling stations would have on 15 gallons of gasoline. And yet, if you look at the real estate plot that they're on, 2/3 of that plot or more are pumps, aren't they? So the question becomes something that they had played with and tried with, but it's how do we drive people into the high margin business? And now with electrification of cars, assuming that they're along a highway and the battery only can go so far, people will come in to charge their cars. If that happens, well, then we're going to have them in our store for 40 minutes, 30, 40 minutes. What are we going to do with them? What can we do? What can we do to sell them products or services? Okay. One of them that we know about is actually offering catering. I mean, and I don't know if it'll work. I applaud them for their thinking, but it's not a place probably you or I would go, for it. But we know that there's lead-ins to this. So if you looked at Costco, for example, why do they sell their hot dog and a drink for $1.50? Because it keeps you in the store. It's a loss leader. The same is true with some of their other items. So the idea of how you want to now change the customer's paradigm of what a convenience store is really going to stretch the thinking of an organization that really never thought that way, and the leader never thought that way.
For our audience, if you don't live in the South, you may not have heard of Buc-ee's.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you to maybe look up a friend from Texas or the Southeast, because Buc-ee's has become a destination. When exactly what you're talking about, when the roadside convenience store is size of 2 football fields,
Yeah.
and it's got 35 islands of pumps. And Joel, recently, in one that I stopped at, the back of the parking lot that's typically empty, they've put Tesla charging stations in.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
as you said, even electric cars that are not going to get the gas, they're going to come and charge there, are going to come into the store and really engage for some extended period of time. We have a quick comment. Just want to just share. I don't know about our audience. I'm up to like 3 pages of notes in this conversation with Joel. He really is an exceptional leader, and I'm delighted that another LinkedIn user has jumped in. It just, emotional intelligence, emotional astutness doesn't begin to, shine a light on Joel's just talent and experiences and unbelievable capabilities. So, Joel, you definitely have phenomenal fans out there. Talk about strategic relationships facilitating organizational leadership transition amid some of this change.
Yeah.
So as you said, whether it's AI, whether it's, modifying the business or altering the business model. Joel, I've got clients that are going through unbelievable hyper growth. So if that demand for what they do, think of people that build data centers, think of people that are amidst of the AI infrastructure world. How do relationships play in that leadership transition, in that, as some of these executives retire, as others need to step up, and perhaps they don't know what to do? How do they succeed?
Well, it's interesting. The question is interesting because it brings into a whole different focus. What I've experienced is growth is the greatest compressor of human capital and of other resources as well. If you want to know why companies fail in venture capital, it isn't always the idea. It's they don't have enough resources, whether it's human or dollars, investors, to bring the idea to market, even though the idea may have, 4 legs and not 2. So the question is, how do you get this alignment right as you grow? And the best companies recognize that the people on the team, the leadership team, aren't people necessarily for all seasons. Everyone brings something different. And you can use all kinds of analogies of why this is, but because people aren't people for all seasons, you can look at history. There was a book written by Winston Churchill, which kind of describes about Winston Churchill. I'm sorry, and it was written by a professor at Cambridge, and he went back and looked at the letters and the correspondences of various kinds of 6 people that influenced Churchill throughout his life. Of course, all these people are well gone, and there's an interview capability like what we're doing today, or just having a chat. And Lord Attlee, who was the head of the Labour Party during the war, said to understand Churchill, he's like a layer cake. And aren't we all layer cakes? We're all products of our experiences and our know-how and our upbringing and so forth. And that kind of sharing allows the leadership to decide where to plug that in, where it is most beneficial to the organization and to our stakeholders. And the people who play in that game will learn more about it than perhaps about themselves, that they will become better leaders themselves. Doesn't mean that they're going to be better leaders in that organization, okay? But you quickly learn more about yourself by challenging yourself, because others are challenging you and you're challenging them. And it's that interplay that develops these leaders. Now, the question you asked before, David, was about generational differences. I can see that happening in mid-career and all the way through the time that one steps out. But people tend to be fascinated by this level of change, and you want to look for those people who become fascinated, not full of anxiety and PTSD about these changes. There was a story about IBM years ago when IBM moved away from the white shirts, I think it was when Lou Gerstner was CEO, and people were allowed to wear colored shirts to work. Well, what a big deal that was. And you had PTSD inside of IBM, more or less. Okay. So, when you think about that and what a small change will mean to a large organization, then one understands that one can play at different levels.
Mm.
And sometimes you're the leader, sometimes you're not. And that's okay. And where you see this in individuals who have this kind of flexibility is they're willing to step sideways to get breadth of experience rather than depth of experience.
Mm.
And the breadth is going to define, I can tell you what our clients are looking for at the very top of the organization, CEOs and what have you, is breadth of experience. Now, there's certain industries where you have to have depth. Okay, you can't run a pharmaceutical company with not understanding the process and the regulatory processes. Nobody's going to ask you to run an investment bank if you've been running a consumer products company. I get that. But if you start to look at the strains of what's important to those stakeholders, the breadth of experience and the way that you draw it out of your people, the way that you demand excellence, if you will, and their contribution is respected and trusted, where people aren't sitting around a table saying, oh, that's stupid, we're not going to do it. No, that's not it. It's not the confrontation. I know people like Ray Dalio thrived on this in his kind of culture. But I don't think that works in most organizations. Okay, it doesn't work in most organizations. I was thinking about a guy who was the chairman of one of the major law firms in the world, 2,000 plus lawyers. And in his retirement, they said he was always known as the leading M&A lawyer in our field. Okay, if we had a deal that couldn't close, we went to this guy. And he thanked them for their comments. He said, I'm not the best. We said, I'm not the best M&A lawyer. I'm the best at building relationships with clients. Okay. So that trust allowed those deals to get done.
Mm.
Well, the trust allows you to be flexible, adaptable, resilient, all the words the consultants use. Okay. All the consultancies. But the truth is, in the world that we're heading into, if you don't have those kinds of relationships and aren't willing to sometimes be subservient, even as a leader, or as a leader have to lead, but you set the culture and allows that to happen, the chances of success in this kind of world is not very high, and your tenure won't be very long.
Joel, I love this, and I want to continue this. In our last few minutes together, what advice would you offer emerging leaders who are aspiring to really prepare themselves for the top roles? Give us the top 2-3 things that you would advise them to think about, double down on, really prioritize.
I think is to get as much breadth and experiences as you can. Take tough engagements, tough things that are going to challenge you, but it will also be noticed by the people in the organization, many of whom wouldn't take it on themselves. Okay, so they're expecting a modicum of success and probably as much failure and trial and tribulation. But the fact that you stayed through it and you built it and you worked through it is going to be something you can carry with you in that organization or another. The second is to be respected and respectful. Seek out other opinions, whether you have your own personal advisory board, maybe, and I think people at the very top, they don't have to be the CEO to have that. I mean, I think everybody needs it. I can tell you what we did in my organization. And, you learn a lot from them, and you can test out things in a safe way. And the confidences that can be shared or stayed there. And that's the discreetness of it. Okay. And you learn from that. And when you talk to CEOs, as an example, you suddenly understand that they're asking questions that somebody had planted that question with them, or some idea at some conference they went to. The thing I would avoid is networking. Forget it. It doesn't work. Okay. What you're seeking for is deep social and intellectual relationships. And as you point out early in the conversation, David, it takes time to get that. You have to give back.
Mm.
Okay, you have to give back. And Warren Buffett said, "We'll see when the water comes in who's still wearing their swimsuit." But paraphrasing, of course. But you want to invest, and you're going to find out that some people who you think will invest in you and you invest in them, it is very imbalanced.
Mm.
You have to be prepared to move on from that, because as you grow, what you're interested in, and where you can play and where you can add value and where you want to add value. The currency is time. It's not money. Okay, so it's a currency of ideas. Okay, so being around the who is really important.
My final question: none of us have a crystal ball, and yet you consistently identified really interesting trends and perspectives. Talk about a couple of trends that are really interesting to you, particularly in corporate governance and leadership succession in the world that you live in day in and day out. It could be concerns, or it could be really optimistically looking forward to them. But what are some of the trends you're watching?
Well, I think the speed of change is something that continually fascinates me, because humans can't adjust, and therefore organizations can't adjust to this kind of speed of change. Because of that, you have to pick those avenues that you are willing to adjust to and be part of. Okay, that's certainly one trend that I'm seeing, and I see it in every field. One can ask, well, what about your field of executive and board searches and succession planning? I can tell you, if we continue doing what we are doing, what we did 5 years ago, it would be like the travel agency business. Okay, and what happened in the travel agency business? If you wanted a ticket, you called the airline, you gave them a credit card, and they sent you a ticket. Or you went to a city office and you talked to three people who were about as motivated as least motivated you could find, and they would write a ticket and make your reservation and give you a credit card. Or you called the travel agent and you did nothing, and they got their 10% from the airline.
Sure.
Well, those days, if you translate it into our business, yeah, you can go. Are we competing against LinkedIn? What are we really competing on? And that's where this advice about judgment has fascinated me. Judgment, experience, and so forth. And if companies don't want to utilize that, then we're going to be out of business too. But the thing that fascinates me more than anything else is the movement of how people learn, how people are learning as these changes go on. There were two dimensions of this. If one was just to look at the number of eyeballs on the news stations between 6 and 10 in the evening, take all of them together, you'll find that there's only about 10 million eyeballs on those stations: ABC, CBS, NBC, NPR, Fox News, Fox Business, CNBC, if I didn't mention them, and so forth, CNN. But when you boil it down, there's only 3.3 million that are watching. Last numbers I saw, which is about 6 months ago, because people watch multiple shows. Yet, how many people really understand the issues in the country? Well, 170 million of us voted, approximately 160 million, whatever the number was. And you ask yourself, isn't that true then of organizations? Because if it's true of people not understanding the basic issues of our society and how we want to live it, how we want to be governed, what about in their own companies, in their own lives? Or do they feel completely lost? So part of this fascination is, how do we learn? And who do we learn from? Now, CEOs don't have time to read. They don't. So they rely on people like you, David, and me to try and bring, a continuity into what they're trying to do and help them achieve it, because we have the time, or we're supposed to be reading and thinking and talking to people and so forth. And
Joel,
it's different. That's all.
It has been, for our audience, if you missed it, you missed a good one. Again, I don't know about you guys, but I'm up to 3 pages of notes. It's always insightful to talk to Joel Koblentz, senior advisor to Koblentz Group. He has been a friend. He's been a colleague for 20 plus years. And every time we talk, I not only gained new insights and perspectives, but just a wisdom that Joel has gained over the years, invaluable. So Joel, thank you for making the time. Thanks for joining us. For our audience, we're live every Tuesday at noon Eastern on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. And I repurpose these into the Inner Circle podcast, wherever you consume podcasts. If you just search David Nour Inner Circle, I think you'll find it. Got some great guests that we've had. Cheryl Cook was our most recent one. Coming up, General Tom Bostic, former Chief of Army Corps of Engineers. Eric McCarthy is a former senior executives at Coke. James Milet was a senior executive at Schneider Electric. He's since moved on to SmartCare. Randy Seidel, CEO of a water technology company. So I'm going out. I'm doing what I practice, what I preach, which is reach out to incredible friends and colleagues and ask their perspective. And these are all operators who live leadership on a daily basis. And as I continue to interview and gain ideas and insights and really coalesce them around this next book called Inner Circle. So I hope this has been useful to you. Again, we're live every Tuesday at noon Eastern. Joel, thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody. All the best and see you next time.
Bye now.